Chapter 14, Nervous System, Spinal Cord and Spinal Nerves, Part 1. So, the spinal cord links the brain to the rest of the body and is to some degree functionally independent of the brain, a little bit. Spinal cord has spinal nerves coming off of it regularly, and these are pathways for both sensory and motor nerve signals, so these are mixed nerves. And also, it is possible that these spinal nerves allow for spinal reflexes. Now, the spinal cord officially starts directly after the foramen magnum of the skull. So anything inferior to the foramen magnum is spinal cord, anything superior to it is brain. And then the spinal cord ends at around the level of L1, the first lumbar vertebra. So it doesn't actually go all the way down through the vertebral canal. However, there are spinal rootlets that come off the spinal cord to become spinal nerves, and these rootlets also travel down through what remains of the spinal canal. Sorry, vertebral canal. All right, you can break the spinal cord up into 5 subdivisions. You have the cervical part in the neck, the thoracic part in the chest area, and the very small lumbar, sacral, and coccygeal parts, very small compared to the rest of the spinal cord. And the coccygeal part has a single spinal nerve. This is cranial nerve, but really it should say spinal nerve. All right, at the very end of the spinal cord, it sort of tapers off into a cone shape, and that is called the conus medullaris. And then the spinal nerves that continue running through the vertebral canal are called the cauda equina, and they are called that because someone thought they looked kind of like a horse's tail. Then at the very end, there is a single strand of the pia mater coming off of the spinal cord that originated way up near lumbar 1, that then connects to and anchors the spinal cord to the end of the coccyx bone. And that is called filum terminalis. So that would be right at the very end. Filum terminalis. The spinal cord widens a little bit in the cervical area, and that is called the cervical enlargement. This is where the neurons and nerves for the upper limbs are coming into and going out of the spinal cord. And then there's also a lumbosacral enlargement toward the end of the spinal cord, and that is where the neurons and nerves for the lower limbs are coming and going. The spinal cord has 31 pairs of spinal nerves, named basically after the general area where they're at. So you got 8 cervical nerves, 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar, 5 sacral, 1 coccygeal. And all spinal nerves are mixed nerves. They have both sensory and motor axons, carrying both information to the spinal cord, sensory, and commands away from the spinal cord, motor. Not surprisingly, the spinal cord is surrounded by the meninges. These are continuous with the cranial meninges, all one continuous sheet of connective tissue. The pia mater, of course, lies on the surface of the spinal cord. Then you have the subarachnoid space, where you'll find the cerebral spinal fluid that helps to protect the spinal cord. Then you have the arachnoid mater, and then the dura mater. Normally these two are connected together, but sometimes if there's some sort of injury, fluid might develop between them, and then you would have a subdural space. But normally there is no subdural space. The arachnoid mater and the dura mater are almost one structure. And then after the dura mater is the epidural space. And in the vertebral canal surrounding the spinal cord, there is always an epidural space between the dura mater and the vertebra. And this epidural space is not empty. It is filled with blood vessels, nerves, adipose tissue, and areolar connective tissue, sort of filling the space and adding additional cushioning and protection to the spinal cord. So here is a transverse section of the spinal cord. We can see the dura mater is on the outside. Next to that is the epidural space, then the vertebral bone. You see that's filled with fatty tissue, areolar connective tissue, blood vessels, dura mater, then arachnoid matter. Then you have the subarachnoid space filled with cerebrospinal fluid, followed by the pia mater lying on the surface of the spinal cord. Now, here again, another transverse section of the spinal cord. We see that it has some spaces associated with it. You have the anterior median fissure in the front and the posterior median sulcus in the back. And these two spaces do not completely divide the spinal cord into a right and left, but does sort of separate it into a right and left side, although the two sides are well connected. Then, of course, superficial is the white matter for the spinal cord, and deep is the gray matter for the spinal cord. And then finally, there is a space in the center called the central canal, right there in part of the gray matter. Central canal is an opening that runs the full length of the spinal cord, and the central canal is filled with cerebral spinal fluid. All right, we have some structures that come off of the spinal cord. Toward the back, we have the posterior rootlets. Posterior rootlets infused form the posterior root, which leads to the posterior root ganglion. This is all on the posterior backside. And then we have the anterior rootlets coming off the front, fusing to form the anterior root. And then the posterior root and anterior root come together to give us the spinal nerve, approximately where the intervertebral foramina is. So that once it leaves the vertebral canal, we now have one structure, the spinal nerve. All right, you all may have heard of a lumbar puncture. This is a way to collect cerebral spinal fluid. And the way this works is that basically they take an extremely large and thick needle and push it through the lower back, in between the vertebra, through an intervertebral disc, into the subarachnoid space to get the cerebrospinal fluid sample. And this is usually just above or below lumbar 4, so it's very back lower region, a little bit above the sacrum. And they choose this area, one, because there's no bone, but two, because there's no spinal cord, so that when the needle goes into the subarachnoid space, it is less likely that it'll damage any nervous structures like the spinal cord. All right, here again is the spinal cord. Gray matter on the inside, white matter on the outside, central canal, posterior median sulcus, anterior median fissure. We find that the gray matter can get broken up into 4 parts. To start with, we have the strip of gray matter connecting the right and left sides. That strip of gray matter is called the gray commissure. It's a horizontal band, primarily composed of unmyelinated axons, which is why it is gray, and it is a communication route for the right and left sides of the spinal cord. Also found within the gray commissure, of course, is the central canal. Then we can break up the rest of the gray matter in the right or left sides of the spinal cord into 3 what are called horns. We have the anterior horn, surprise, surprise, toward the front, the lateral horn to the side, and the posterior horn. Now, the anterior horn is where you'll find the cell bodies to somatic motor neurons, so neurons that control skeletal muscles. And in the lateral horns, you'll find cell bodies to the autonomic motor neurons that control the smooth muscle tissue, cardiac muscle tissue, and glands. So, basically, there are motor nuclei in the anterior horn and lateral horn, and this is where then commands for the skeletal muscles and smooth muscle tissue and cardiac muscle tissue and glands are arriving, so that anything that is approximately at the same level will be receiving commands from this area in the spinal cord. They will synapse with another motor neuron that will then leave through the anterior root. The posterior horn, on the other hand, has the axons of sensory neurons carrying information to the spinal cord, as well as cell bodies for interneurons that are synapsing with those axons that will then carry that sensory information up to the brain. So posterior horn, sensory information going up to the brain. So we have various sensory nuclei for both somatic sensations and visceral sensory information found in the posterior horn. So somatic, again, from various sensory receptors that we're more familiar with in the skin and muscles. And then the visceral sensory nuclei is for blood vessels and the other organs and glands in the body. And so the sensory information arrives through the spinal nerve, travels through the posterior root ganglion, the posterior root, and then the information arrives in the posterior horn, synapses with interneurons that then can carry that information into the white matter and up to the brain. Now, the white matter can also be broken down into smaller divisions. So these are referred to as funiculi, one funiculus, many funiculi. So there's 3 funiculi and the white commissure. And of course, there's right and left for each funiculus. So the funiculi have both ascending and descending tracts, carrying both commands from the brain and sending sensory information to the brain. So ascending tracts carry the sensory information going to the brain. Descending tracts carry the motor commands from the brain to the body. And you have a posterior funiculus, lateral funiculus, and anterior funiculus. And then there is some white matter that stretches between the two sides that is called the white commissure. So anterior to the gray commissure is the white commissure. Again, posterior funiculus, lateral funiculus, anterior funiculus, and white commissure. So, injuries to the spinal cord. Injuries to the spinal cord can lead to permanent damage that could leave a person paralyzed and or unable to perceive sensations to various parts of their bodies. Someone with monoplegia has paralysis of only one limb, so only part of the spinal cord was damaged. It did not get cut all the way through. Paraplegia is paralysis of both lower limbs, so there was injury to a lower part of the spinal cord, going all the way through. Hemiplegia is paralysis of an upper limb, trunk, and lower limb on one side of the body. So one half of the spinal cord was cut, probably pretty high up, leading to paralysis of that side of the body. And quadriplegia is paralysis of all 4 limbs. Again, it will be damage to a superior portion of the spinal cord and will be cutting completely through the spinal cord so that the paralysis is basically everything from that injury down, all 4 limbs, trunk of the body. And that is where we stop this part of the lecture.